one of the key things you're trying to do with discovery is you are trying to not go in with presuppositions. And if you go in seeking the answers that you want, that results in poor framing of your questions. Because subconsciously you're trying to get to the answer that you've already conceived of. When you leave it a little open-ended through a lot of these techniques, especially asking for a story, you kind of go broad before you narrow down. And that's important because you may end up in a place which you had not imagined before. You may end up with that Salesforce rep uncovering the service log. And so it's important to go broad before you go narrow. You may end up with bullet points at the end of the day. So through that story with Eric, if I was in a discovery, I would probably come up with, so the takeaways of this story are X, Y, and Z. But I got to it in a bit of a roundabout way, but in a way that was meaningful to Eric. And most importantly, I uncovered the emotion behind it. So a lot of times, it's not as important to tackle the highest priority item that a prospect is articulating. It's more important to address the one that he cares about the most, right? And with a story, you kind of get to that point. The last one is the art of observing. So you've kind of cleared the clutter in your head. You've asked questions in a way that elicits good responses. The third is, what do you do with that information? And how do you make sure that information doesn't fall in that gap between 125 and 400 words? So how do we hone our observation skills so that we can latch on to something that the other person is saying or not saying, that we can hook the rest of the sales process on? And there are obviously a number of things you can do in terms of observations, but these four I found to be the most useful. Looking for patterns, looking for adaptations, being cognizant of surprises and not letting them pass or pushing them under the rug, and watching out for the emotion. What does this person care about? So I think patterns and surprises we kind of innately understand, and they're kind of opposites, right? So we're very good at pattern matching. What I found is we're not good at surprises, because the reason I mentioned earlier, which is we're trying to look for the answer that we already know. So when there's a surprise, we tend to brush that under the rug. It's important to pay attention to those surprises and dive deeper into them. Adaptations are kind of giveaways, and it's like a low-hanging fruit. If you see an adaptation, that's a very clear sign that this person has a problem that they want to solve. And they've solved for it in a way that's ad hoc or suboptimal. And you can address it right away with a more elegant solution. And emotions, as I mentioned, it's key. A lot of our buying decisions are emotional. We don't buy a Mercedes-Benz over Audi because the Benz is better. We buy it because we have an emotional connect with the car, which can do kind of the same thing that 10 other cars do. And so being aware of the emotions through the techniques we've talked about is very important. So we've done our prep, we've conducted this discovery. What do we do with all that information? How do we take that and go back to the purpose of discovery that we talked about, which is to create the map, the context map, and to identify the insight? How do we synthesize the information in a way that we can propel the sales engagement forward? And I borrowed from a framework or a process called design thinking. For those of you who may not be aware, Design thinking is a very well-known and emerging framework that companies use to develop innovative solutions and products. But we can repurpose it for our own use. A how might we statement is great at capturing insights. And these three words have been chosen carefully. How is solution oriented? You're not stuck at why or why not, but you kind of open the space to think about the solution. Might is optimistic, it's experimental. So you're leaving room for more solutions to be on the table and to put the other person in a more experimental mode. And we is collaborative. It's not about what I can do for you, it's what can we accomplish together, both the vendor and the prospect. An example of a how might we statement is, how might we encourage kids to read more, right? There are good how might we statements and bad how might we statements. A bad how might we statement sounds like this. How might we develop a better wheelbarrow? Can somebody identify what the problem might be with that statement? How might we develop a better wheelbarrow?
Leading.
It's leading. It presupposes that a better wheelbarrow is the right solution. It's too narrow. As opposed to how might we develop a contraption or a mechanism to transport heavy objects from point A to point B. You may end up with a better wheelbarrow, but you may end up with something completely different. You may end up with a forklift. You may end up with a robot, whatever. But you've kind of left it a little bit broader. You've left some things for the imagination, but you've still kept it focused enough that you're going to end up at a place which is going to solve a true problem. So a how might we statement contains a big idea. It should compel the prospect to action. So it's typically something that you would share with your prospect. And you want them to nod vigorously. You want them to do something with that insight and take action. And take action may not be just buy your solution. Take action might be, hey, I didn't realize I had this problem, let me dive deeper into it. It should be broad enough, but not too broad, like I mentioned, and it must be clear and concise. Another example of a bad hump.
Somebody have a mic.